recording? Okay, so this is the LianLi PC60 case. It came with forefront USB. These were, I think these were 2.0, but I'm not 100% sure. This is 2003 tech. I think they were 2.0 though, USB ports. So it came with 4 that were right there built on the front with this nice little case. The whole case is aluminum except for this plastic piece at the top here that is, you know, what is it? Carbon fiber look. And it came with 3 different 3.5 inch drive slots and 4 full-size 5 1/4 slots that I actually still have the faces for. And then I'll put that in. So these go in there. I don't know if you can see that or not. And right now I have a Imperex off-brand DVD-ROM drive that I got, I think, primarily because an older drive had failed and because it had its own USB port on the top, and it also came, more importantly, came with compact flash and different SD cards, so I could offload stuff onto the hard drive if I needed to from things like video cameras and so on. This is a DVD RW, so it actually will record DVD, and so the reason for having 2 was so that if I wanted to copy stuff from one to the other, although I'm not engaging in any sort of copyright fraud, I wasn't actually taking DVDs and recording it on there. In fact, honestly, I don't even know if I've ever actually recorded anything with this, other than maybe CD-ROMs, which it does as well. These are the older standard PATA, parallel ATA, as opposed to SATA, which is serial ATA, which means they use the old flat, wide ribbon cables on them, and they will not be having those type of ports on the new motherboard, so I will not be able to use these directly. I do have an adapter that will allow me to convert SATA or PATA to SATA, so conceivably I could plug them into a SATA port if I need to. What I probably plan to do, because I really don't plan to actually have these in, is I may just pull one of these out and put it into an external case that I have and plug it in that way into the back of the machine so that I can do offloading, because what I do plan to do once I get this thing built is offload a whole bunch of music CDs and old DVDs onto this thing, so again I can use it as a home media server. And then down here I have the old 3.5 inch floppy drive, which for those of you who were born after the 1990, say 5, you probably have no idea what this is. This was the standard for a long time. Before that we had a 5 1/4 inch floppy drive that were these really old flimsy things that were used back when I first started using computers in the early 80s. But this has, to give you an idea, your typical flash card, memory card nowadays, like the card that we're doing some of the shooting on, is like 32 gigabytes, and that's actually a fairly small one. This was a whopping, I think it was 880 kilobytes. No, I'm sorry, that was the old style. These would have been 1.44. I think these would have been up to a megabyte. I'm not 100% sure on that. And then below that is a iOmega Zip 100 drive, which allowed you to store on something that was a bit bigger than, in thickness than the old floppy drive, but it's essentially like a larger version of a floppy drive that held up to 100 megabytes, as opposed to this would have been 1.44 megabytes. And as compared to the modern card, which is 32 gigabytes, it gives you an idea how far we've come in terms of what we're able to do. You've got inlets for the front-facing fan, which I'll show you a bit more in a minute, big power reset button, and blue and red LEDs to let you know when the thing is operating and what it's doing. So one of them is for the hard drive. I believe that's the blue one, and the red one is for power. And then it's actually got a little spot here for like your Intel Inside or whatever sticker you want to put on it. Although that's never been one of my big things. I'm not into really advertising for other people that much, even though I know that's how YouTubers make money. So this front face pops off. It's just not cooperating with me right now, in part because it's sitting on this tablecloth. There it goes. Just these tabs on the back, and they've gotten fairly old. The nice part about LianLi is a lot of the stuff is still made, and I actually, one of these tabs that this plugs into up the top broke out. I don't know if you can see it. There's like 2 little knobs here, and there's only one here because the other one busted out, but I plan to get a replacement for that. And there's all sorts of different things that LianLi makes, like they make their own slide into one of these 5 1/4 slots, power fans if you want to have a fan blow, or they have like a, I think they have one that's like with a digital display that'll give you a different monitor, so you can plug it into the different fan headers and actually be able to see what your fan speeds are operating at, things of that sort. The nice part about this case Nowadays it's kind of common, but back in the day this was kind of unusual. Everything's kind of held in with these thumb screws, so it's really easy to make different modifications as you put stuff in. As you can see down here, you've got cooling fan speeds 1 through 3. 3 is actually low, 1 is the high setting, so you can control your fan speed. As you can tell, it's fairly dusty at the moment. I need to actually take this out. Behind the screen here is, and you can probably see it through all the dust there, there's like a filter that helps to keep some of the dust from getting inside the machine. I'm gonna stop. Now, starting from the top up here, it's got another fan. This is a blow-out fan. The front fans suck air in, the top fan and the back fan blow air out. I don't know if you're in a close-up or a long shot.
It's like,
okay.
how close do you want it?
That's fine. So this is a blow-out fan. As you can see, it's got, the only other bits of plastic on it are these plastic rivets that it uses to hold the fan on, which at some point I may have to change that out because these older fans tend to be a little bit noisy, and these are sleeve bearing style fans which aren't as efficient or as quiet as the more modern bearing fans. But they still work and it's still fairly quiet, and at some point when I do a startup you'll be able to tell. The whole exterior of the case is this brushed aluminum. It's really nice. It's got a little ding up here because it's fairly old. But again, coming back to the back side, this will give you an idea of everything that's in there right now, and even though I said earlier I don't really like a lot of the stickers, this MSI sticker actually is the exact size of the hole, or the spot that's cut out on the front plate for holding a sticker. It lets you know the power supply, Windows XP, and the Gigabyte drive. And I was talking earlier about how the plates on the back in the old style had these kind of retaining springs on them. It's just, this piece just seems a lot more flimsy than the modern one that I have in the modern case. As you can see, there's a fair number of cards in here right now. This is an external SATA card, so that you can, if you want to run external SATA drives like a backup drive. This is another USB card. I think that's all, again, 2.0, because I don't think I had anything better than that. This one is the sound card, which actually works in conjunction with the built-in sound card on the motherboard. They work together to give you a full 7.1. At one point I had a Creative 7.1 system in it. I think it might be that this card came with the Creative speaker system that I had on it, and then we've got the video card. And as I said before, these are all thumb screws, so now we can do thumb screws and start to open up the case. And if you come around to the side here, I just push it lightly. Just pops in and out. Slides right out and comes off. Again, it's all nice aluminum, dusty, needs to be cleaned. This is obviously the back side that you don't typically see. This is the back, I would call it a black backing plate, although I'm sure there's a better term for it, that the motherboard attaches to. You've got the different standoffs. It doesn't use plastic standoffs, it actually uses metal ones, which is nice, and will make it reusable. And it actually came with, I have a small jar that I've got extra standoffs in so that I can move them around as needed depending on the type and the style of the motherboard. You can see it's got a lot of standard standoff points to mount. And for those that don't know, a standoff is just basically allows the motherboard to attach to the plate, but gives it just a bit of a gap. So you get better airflow around the motherboard. And my God, this thing is dusty. I'm gonna have to clean it. Up here you've got, these are different headers for the USB data and power ports for the front facing USB. This is for 3 and 4. There's no one for 1 and 2 at the time because of what I had going on in the background, and I only had so many USB ports on the motherboard. I have these disconnected. And typically this side of the computer is where your cable management is going to be. And as you can see, if you're familiar with modern cases, there'll usually be some bigger holes through in these various areas, so you have places to pass through your cables. So in some sense, it's not as advanced as some of the more modern computer cases that are out there for builders, but still fairly nice. It's all, heavy duty rivets, quality. This actually internals, this I know is aluminum. This I'm not 100% sure, it could be metal. The case is fairly substantial. Mind you, right now I've got 2 hard drives, 2 floppy drives, 2 DVD drives and CPU and so forth in there, and it probably weighs close to 30 pounds. I mean, it's fairly substantial. Some of the drives, obviously, and the power supply add a lot of weight. And anyway, that's the dull side, although you can see one of the fans back here. This is one of the front-facing fans that draws air in. And then the power headers for these two are for the buttons, the on button and the reset button. And then down here, this little card here is for the two LED lamps that are on the front that I was showing before. Oh, you guys. Did I say it was heavy? And this is the guts. And again, don't be too upset with me about my cable management. Again, this stuff had been in and out several times, and so I had kind of loosely tied things away for the time being. There are some things like this. Actually, this cable tie that's on here was factory, if you will, from Intermax when the power supply came in. And again, as I was saying before, part of the reason why you see this big mess is this is what you had to do, is figure out where you were going to put the wires, because back in the day, all the wiring you could ever need, or all the wiring you could ever get, came pre-wired and hardwired onto the power supply itself. So you didn't have a lot of ability to kind of maintain cables. The nice part about the new system is I only put the cables in as and when I need them, so it makes it much easier to do cable management and keep things nice and neat. You've got power supply for the back fan. This is the fan that actually comes on the case itself. And then, as you can see, the lovely old components, the old Gigabyte motherboard, Intel Pentium 4, 2.53 gigahertz processor. This little riser card is part of the old Gigabyte power management system that allowed it to do overclocking without getting too hot, because as you can see, it's got a couple different fans that are built onto the riser card and the motherboard itself to cool down the various power supply sources for it. And yes, it's fairly dusty in here because this case hasn't been cleaned in years. And so part of what we have to do today before we can put the new stuff in is get all the old stuff out. And I'm not taking the stuff out because it stopped working. It actually still works fairly well, other than it has Windows XP on it, which is no longer supported. And as a result, it's got old versions of things like, like the browser and stuff, things of that sort. And now, because of the way that YouTube works, it won't even really load and play YouTube videos. And some of that could be solved by putting in a more recent operating system and updating the various software that's on here. But you are, to some extent, hardware limited, because a lot of the stuff that we have nowadays is kind of written for, you know, the various software things like games and stuff are specifically written for the particular types of components that are being used nowadays. And so a lot of them take advantage, for example, of the fact that there are multiple cores on a processor. This is a single core processor. So because of that, this old system's going to come out. This would probably, because it still works, be fine for maybe building some sort of a Linux box or something of that sort, but that's not really what I want to do, and it feels like I'm going to need a screwdriver to get some of these thumb screws out because they've gotten tight. Has a nice cage here. I'll pull out to show you. You have to disconnect a bunch of things to get there. For the hard drives, the old style hard drives, 3.5 inch. And as you can see, the case itself is made out of aluminum, so you get a lot of natural heat sink that goes on, because aluminum tends to absorb and release heat faster than metal does. So that's nice for maintaining cooler temperatures for all your equipment. And remember, I was telling you about parallel ATA ribbon cables. That's what these are. Older style parallel ATA cables. And they worked well for a time, although their data capability isn't as good as modern SATA is, which really has more to do with the cards and the design of the cards than the cables themselves. But look how wide they are. And you can see the cables kind of get bent over time, and I get concerned about, you see that hard spot there, you have to wonder if you're going to get a break in the cable itself, in which case you end up having issues where the data doesn't transfer correctly. And because of the thickness, obviously it creates a lot of restrictions for the airflow through the case. That's why it's nice to move into SATA. That was one of the big advantages of the SATA standards because the cables were a lot smaller. I'll give an example. Here is a SATA cable. You can see it's substantially smaller, this little red cable. Just disconnect it. So you get a lot better flow through the case because you don't have such a large cable. It's still kind of a ribbon cable in the sense it's a flat cable, which tend to be, in my mind, a little harder to manipulate. Now, what we used to do in the old days with modders is we would use this kind of cable here, which is still a ribbon cable, but it's been done with soft wires instead of hard wires, and it's been put into a sheath. And unfortunately, this has gotten old and gummy, so it feels really tacky right now. And these were actually clear, and now they're kind of yellow stained from age. But that was one way to help kind of create better airflow through the case, although you still had to expand it out. These are actually supposed to be up around this. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. In any event, it created a little bit better airflow path. And nothing else that looked cooler. Remember how this one comes off. And these can be a little difficult to get off just because. There it goes. And this was nice because it had labels, Ultra ATA. And the other thing about the old style cable systems, one thing that they did have versus the SATA cable systems, is these were actually, in effect, two cables in one, because you could hook up two devices. You had a master and a slave. And that was because what they considered with the ATA 133 standard was that there was enough speed going through that you could have, conceivably, if you had a fast enough processor on the other end, you could have two devices hooked up at once, and they could both be sending data. And part of it was because typically, even if you had two devices, they wouldn't both be operating at the same time. But that effectively doubled the amount of devices you could have in the system, because you didn't have to have two sets of cables, one for each device. But what it also meant was that back in the day, you used to have to do these pins. I'll show you the back of the hard drives at the moment. They had these old pins in the old SATA drive where you could put these connectors. And depending on what type, where you had it, would depend on, you could identify which one is the master and which one is the slave. For older systems, you actually had to do that because otherwise the computer wouldn't be able to operate correctly. These are both set, I think, at cable select, or yeah, it might have been cable select is what they called it, which basically meant that the system would figure it out on its own. This is a little bit newer system. It was a little smarter. It had that capability compared to the stuff that was built in like the 80s. And actually back in the 80s, since we're talking about historic stuff, you could actually had to set what they would call dip switches, similar type of thing. And you had all these different dip switches you had to set just to be able to put your computer together. Required a bit more knowledge, or at least a different type of knowledge than what you have to nowadays to build something. All right, this cable's almost completely out. This one was actually connected to a master and slave because this connected both of the optical drives. So there you have it. That's out of the way. And while I'm chatting about all this, I don't know how much of this is going to wind up on the video because we'll probably end up editing it out, speeding through it, because this is obviously not the most exciting thing in the world to watch. Most people want to see it when it's put together and not when it's being taken apart. Check and see it's still connected. That. Get that out of the way. Let's go ahead and pull those out too. That's the main power supply. There's your old, how many pins was that? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20 pin ATX standard power supply. And again, Intermax, nice stuff. This one at least had a sleeve around it, fairly well built. These are the older pins for the floppy drives. And again, these would normally have been flat cables. This was something I bought because it allowed a bit more airflow through the system, and it's a nice wrapped cable because this is the floppy drive and not the hard drive. The pin sets are closer together, and I believe, without counting it, that it used fewer pins. I used to know this stuff, but it's been so darn long I don't really remember any longer. Let's just count it. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 2, 4, 6, 8, 20, 2, 4, 6, 8, 30, 32, 30. So this is a 34 pin, so it definitely has fewer because I'm pretty sure these are 40. Yeah. Yeah, so this is a 40 pin. This is a 34 pin for a floppy. And then for those of you who are curious and want to know things, these are called Molex connectors. I'm sure Molex was just the standard, or the person who came up with the standard. And that is pretty much your typical power connector in a computer. Even to this day, this is a standard that's probably, I don't know, God, 30 years old at least. You have different power supplies on each pin. The black typically tend to be grounds, which probably only got 2 of them, so I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, probably two black for the grounds, and then the 2 yellow and the 2 red for the different power supplies. My guess is the yellow because it's thicker. Well, maybe not. Anyway, I'm thinking one of those power supplies is 12 volt, one of them is 3.3 volt or 5 volt. In this system, probably 12 and 5 volt, and then you've got the smaller cables for lower power devices that use that same standard. So in this case, right now I'm just trying to separate all the power cables out of the way so I can pull the power supply out, but I have to get that out before I can take the motherboard and the hard drive out. This is a connector for the USB, and this connects to that optical drive that's up there. And it's actually a double connector, so this actually runs 2 USB ports. At least that's what it looks like. Power supply. Another power supply. Alright, so that comes out. And this is a connector for sound. And my guess is so if you're going to play DVD, you can go directly from the optical device to the sound card rather than running it through the central processing unit in order to get power to there. This cable feels like it's hardwired in, so I'll probably just take it out with the thing. And I'm at a point now where I might actually have to go get a screwdriver before I can go any further.
Okay.
You probably want to come around for this, I suppose. So again, everything comes apart really easily. It's all modular, so it's fairly easy to work with, which is the reason why I bought this. I wanted to have a case that I could, as a builder, I could pull apart and take out and put together again and again. So power supply just slides right out like this. And actually most cases anymore that are, say, less than 20 or 25 years old will have this kind of capability where you can pull things out, pull the power supply out anyway, and replace it. I'm caught on something, which is why I'm not taking this out just yet. I'll just set that on its face. So you begin to see what I was talking about. First, the modular power supply. These are all hardwired, and it all goes directly in there. This is still a really nice power supply, and it works really well. This is an Enermax Whisper 465, EG465P. I'm trying to decide how many, 431 watts total power versus 650. The thing you need to know about these watts that they advertise on these things is you can't get too excited about it, because it's not just the total watts that matters, it's also how much you have in terms of total wattage on each different power leg, because you have different power legs for different things. 12 volt typically runs things like hard drives, mechanical drives, and optical drives. Your 5 volt will run some of your different cards and stuff, and your 3.3 volts is typically a step down voltage for things like the CPU and things of that sort. And so when you're figuring out how much power supply you need to have for your machine, you really need to figure out what components you're going to put in it, because that's the only way you're really going to be able to know whether or not the power supply you have is actually going to be adequate. You need to make sure that it has not just total power, but that it has enough power of each type that you're going to need for the devices you're going to be putting into it. Alright, so and the nice part is you've got, as you see, different slots depending on where you're mounting something. You've got different holes to put your screws into to hold the different devices into the computer, keep from moving around. And that is those are for the small floppy drives, but I think I actually still have the screws on the other side to undo on those. I already undid the screws on the other side for this just because it's easier to do that off camera than to have the camera moving around. And you may see in my hand here, on my left hand, there is a black strap. That is a electrical, basically a grounding strap that allows me to ground myself to the chassis because I'm standing on carpet, and that helps to control the amount of electrical discharge that might happen so that I don't accidentally end up discharging into the central processing unit and shorting it out. And this will not come out until I actually take the screws out. And of course one fell. Genius. Okay, still on the case. This one, again, because it had all of the different ports in the front, they communicated through the system on the bus, through the USB bus on there. So this is probably a 2-port USB. So this would take up essentially 2 USB slots on it, which is part of the reason why I only had 2 of the 4 front USB slots connected. Oh my god, this thing's dusty. Every now and again you actually have to clean your case out. So those, and as I showed before, these are the old, this is the old PATA, parallel ATA interface that is not going to be on the new motherboard, so I won't be able to connect that. You've got an audio, on this particular one you have an audio out, which I took out, it was a gray cord, that allows the, like if you're playing a CD, it sends it directly to the audio card on the motherboard, or the audio chip on the motherboard, so it bypasses the CPU, which makes it more efficient. So this is digital, this is analog. Actually, it might have been this analog port, not the digital out. And again, we have a jumper switch that allows you to select whether it's the slave or the master or cable select. And you have the IDE port, parallel ATA, and then the Molex power input. Similarly, on the old one, obviously fewer ports, but you have, this is your cable select, this is your ATA interface, power supply, and then this might have been a similar type of thing where it actually had an audio out to connect directly to the, here's your analog audio out to connect directly to the audio card, and then your cable select. And then I'm not sure what this one was for. It might have been this might have been a digital out or an alternative power supply. I can't really read. There's nothing marked on it, so I'm not really sure. I do have the books for these. I just don't have them handy with me right at the moment. And so we'll move these out of the way. Now, my handy dandy video person is helping me out here. Now, let me tell you, you take out the power supply and the 2 hard drives, and wow, does this thing get light. So this gives you a really nice view of the interior of the thing. There is a plastic wrap here that helps protect your hand from the sharp edges and stuff and cables and things of that sort. There's actually another one for the other side that's missing at the moment, but I do have it. It's in the case. I just, for some reason, at one point or another, it fell out, and I got to put it back on. Something else that's interesting, I don't know whether modern cases have them or not, but this case has. You see down here, this is just an old speaker, a little speaker. So when you power on, when you do power on self-test or post, that's the thing you'll hear the beeps come through typically as it goes to that speaker and not to the external speakers if you have them plugged in. So that one's kind of directly wired. I'm looking for the wiring that goes to it. It's probably one of these. Anyway, it's directly wired to the motherboard. And I'm turning this up just for a second because I also want to take these drives out. And I just need to get their screws off the back side. This is one of the few things that isn't done with thumb screws. And to support it while I take these screws out, because once I take them out, there's nothing holding it up anymore. It could just fall. It should actually stay in place because it's okay. In order to take this out completely, I'm actually going to have to take, this is a separate cage, I'm going to take the cage out. There's thumb screws on the front here. But since I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and pull this other screw out first. So that's kind of nice because this effectively works like a secondary hard drive cage if you want it to. So, and in fact, I will probably end up using it for that purpose. So the main cage we took out earlier will hold 4 drives, and this little cage, separate cage, will hold another 3. So I can have up to 7 drives in this thing. And that's not including the M.2 drive that I'll have that will mount directly to the motherboard. This is just a little tight. There we go. So now that cage should just slide out. See if it, oh, there's another one down at the bottom. Doing a great job of dropping things today. And now comes the cage. And we can take the screws off the front. We couldn't take them off while it was in there because they were partially blocked by the frame of the computer. So we can take that one out. Let me pause for a second. The front-facing cage, and you can see it's got slots in it to hold 3 hard drives, or 3 external drives, however you want to do it. And this, if you're using the external drives, then you have to take these out. But since I'm going to be probably putting hard drives back in there, let's see if there is a, it's a particular order. So you've got 2 pins at the bottom that slide into the slot, and 1 pin at the top. So we just pop those in place, and it just, they're kind of spring clipped into place. Voila! It even has a little arrow that shows you that they go up. I don't know if that shows up on camera or not. Right there. So that's fun, because then, again, this is part of what makes these more expensive, nicer modding cases so nice, is that just they're so easy to customize and build on because everything just kind of snaps together. It's almost like playing with Legos. So, which I did a lot as a kid. So, anyway, I have a cloth here. Just while I'm getting ready, I'm just kind of cleaning up the worst of the dust off of this thing because it has about 20 years worth of dust on it, seemingly. And so that's ready to go. We'll put that back in later on. I may put it back on after I get the thing built, but before I put the hard drives. I do intend to put the hard drives in there at some point, but may not do it right away. This cage mount for the hard drives is riveted on, so it doesn't come out, which makes it a little hard to get to the dusty spots underneath. But let me come back in there. Some of that's a little bit sharp too. For the most part, this is all these like edges and stuff are all rounded. Again, LianLi did a lot of work to try and make this case as builder friendly as possible, so you don't have a lot of sharp edges. Really, you probably have as much sharp edges from the plastic as you do from any of the metal pieces. So now we're going to go ahead and remove some of these cards. And this was the, again, take some of the dust off of this thing. This was the external SATA. You can have 2 different SATA, external SATA drives, so it's great for a backup. And I'll probably save this. I may end up reusing it in one of my ports in the new machine. And this, just because of the fact it doesn't actually take up like a PCIe X. It doesn't run on the PCI board. It runs on the SATA board. So internally, you have 2 SATA eSATA, external SATA connectors, and then in the back you've got 2 internal SATA. So we'll use 2 of the SATA ports on the motherboard if we don't end up using them all internally. And I don't know for sure I'm going to end up using them all internally, at least not right away. But that'll be something that is handy and worth keeping. Now this is the older, probably the older SATA standard, so it may not have quite as fast a throughput, but even that's better than nothing for backup. We're going to do an external backup. This one is the USB, and again, everything's held in with thumb screws, which is really nice. I probably didn't have to take that thumb screw out completely. And so here's our USB. Can't read it. Can you read it? My handy dandy helper here. Put on my eyes. High-speed USB certified. So this would be, this might be, nope, it's USB 2.0, it says right here. Thought maybe it would be high speed would be 3.0, but Actually, I think the USB standard is USB 1.0 was standard speed, USB 2.0 was high speed, USB 3.0 and above are super speed. I'm not sure what they're going to call it after that because I'm sure they'll go to a higher standard yet. USB is universal serial bus, which is just the type of connector or the type of how the data's, how the excuse me, processor is wired, designed, and the throughput of the data. In universal, and it was just supposed to be a standardized connector, which they've used. Although since the original standard came out, they've come out with a couple different connector types. So you have USB Type A, which is what those were. Now you've got types. And I think there's a B and a C. I know there's a C, but I think there's a B as well. And you've got micro USB, and so you just different connection standards. But they're trying to do as much as they can to keep it standardized so that you can have a lot of different devices connecting to it. The cool part about the universal serial bus, which is something I believe was actually created by Microsoft, is that you can daisy chain devices and have up to 127 devices connected onto a single port, or at least to a single processor, USB processor. This is the MSI Radeon NVIDIA, I think it's an NVIDIA Radeon type card, and this one I will have to take the excuse me, connector all the way out. And this goes into the older, why does it feel like it's connected? Make sure I'm not, I actually might be held on with two. Let's get this out of the way. Okay, that was something beneath it. So this was the audio card, which has got a couple different ports on the motherboard it connects to. I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm coughing so much. It's not because of the dust, it's something in my throat. So you've got it's got this SPDIF output, that's for a digital output. I don't know if the standard ever really took off, but it seems like it's been on a lot of things, even up through the late 2000s, or single digit 2000s, before maybe even to the 2010s. But the idea is it was a optical port, actually, I believe. Or at least it was a digital port of some sort where it would send, this looks like it's just no, that might be an optical port. I don't know if you can see down in there. It might actually send an optical signal down there, which basically is a beam of light. It's like an LED that shoots a light and it vibrates at a frequency. And that's what sends the signal to a processor at the other end, like a high-end audio, like if you had a big high-end audio receiver, which could process it with its own internal encoder decoder. And I believe that's an RCA jack of some sort, but I'm not 100% sure what it was used for. It's kind of hard to read. It says SPDIF there, but I can't really read what that says. Yeah, it just says RCA. So it's an RCA out. It's probably an RCA stereo out. Although it actually couldn't be a stereo out because the old stereo systems had a left and right channel separate. So I'm not really sure what that would be for. And actually, maybe it's an RCA input instead. And then you've got your surround sound, center channel, and I believe that one of these, I believe, is a center channel. One of them's for a subwoofer. So actually, that's probably subwoofer, and that might be a center channel for a 7.1 audio or 5.1 audio system. We'll set that out of the way. And let's see what's left. Oh yeah, we're taking out the video card, just starting to come out. It's caught on something. It does have a power connector, but it stays on the card. Oh, there it goes. A little dusty. And there goes my switch for my. Oh, okay, it's just a. While we're off camera, I was asked by my handy dandy photographer, happens to be my daughter, what's the significance of thumb screws? In the old days, cases, you would have to use a screwdriver to pull the whole case apart, or in some instances you need some type of a, I'm trying to think of the word, socket set, because things are all in sockets and things of that sort. Or they were just, in a lot of cases, a lot of the stuff was riveted, even the boards could have been like riveted down, so it wasn't terribly easy to take things in and out. Although with the microcomputer standard of the IBM PC personal computer that was built, it was designed from the outset to be modular, so you could have daughter cards, which is essentially all these things that plug into these things would be considered either peripheral or daughter cards. The old computers actually truly did have a daughter card system where you'd have a main board, which is the motherboard, and then you'd have a separate daughter card that might actually have some of these but were then back then ISA slots on them where you could connect different peripherals. So now we're sliding out the backing plate that holds the motherboard, and I will probably set that aside for a moment off camera so that I can remove this, because right now we're done with working with the frame. And now that it's all taken out, this frame weighs maybe 3 pounds. It's super light. And it sounds like we have things that are loose in it still. Alright, so let's just do this. Take the alligator clip off of there. While I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and pop back in these cover plates, which are, again, have an arrow pointing up, which is really nice. And just kind of pop in place. Okay, that's that. Should have one more. Yeah, there. And again, I'm not really planning to use any of the devices. And it really cleans up the case. I mean, I don't know if you saw those old optical drives. They were all different colors. They didn't really match. Would have been nice if I could have gotten faceplates on them that all matched the color of the machine itself. Okay, why is this a rock? Oh, there must be a... Oh, yeah, okay. Anyway, case itself, super light. It, again, because it's all aluminum, the whole frame is all aluminum. Like I said before, I thought these were metal, but they're not. Actually, while I'm here, if I can find it, I'm going to go ahead and put this back in. There, and we get the nice edge protectors on all these things that still have somewhat sharp edges. And we will take this out of the way so we can move into building the actual machine. Graphics card. This is an AGP 8X standard card. And it actually had its own little cooler fan, although you can see nowhere near as large as the modern fans. But it probably didn't run quite as hot either with the processors that it had in it. And there were different, this was a kind of a PCI standard, but it was a specific standard that they created for video cards that was popular back in the early 2000s. And it allowed a lot faster data throughputs from the GPU, graphical processing unit, to the motherboard, and then out to the various components like your displays and what have you. And actually it'd be pulling data off of the CPU and then processing it with the GPU. So it's this probably weighs about 2 pounds, which is reasonably heavy, but it's probably not even half as heavy as the modern one that I'm going to be putting in it. It has a card and a whole system on it, and it's actually, this is a single width, whereas the new one is a double width because it has the ports, and then it also has its own little fan exhaust port for the whole fan system. It's got 2 fans that run the full length of the board, and it's got cooling fins that run pretty much the full length of the board, whereas this has only got this rather nice looking copper. It's a little, I'm not really sure what's going on here with this discoloration in the plastic. It almost looks like it got wet or something, but I don't know how that would have happened. In any event, still works. I was using it, I actually booted it up and was using it the other day. And I actually have recorded video of it actually running, although I didn't really do much with it when I recorded it. I just mostly showed it powering up. It has your standard VGA output. It's missing the screw holder for that. This is your S-video output, I believe, for like if you're running, there was a video standard for monitors that use that, and then your DVI. And it was dual monitor capable. I had one connected to VGA, one connected to DVI, and it worked pretty good. And it was running 1080p, I believe, on that card. I don't know that it would be all that fast for modern gaming, but I'm sure it was pretty decent back in the day. And again, even when I built this machine, I really wasn't looking for a gaming system. I was mostly watching YouTube videos and doing work on it. So now we have down to, this is just an external, a power supply for the top fan that connects to Molex connector. So you've got the main Molex connector, which will give power supply to this, and then you have an extension so you can power something else you can connect. If you've got the right connectors, these are all Well, here's male to female. So, for example, you can connect these two together. And now you've got the two fans connected together. You can connect them to one power source, and both fans can be powered off of that power source. And it could be either this one or this one. Well, male or female, depending on what you have to connect to it. I don't really need that done like that for now, so I'm going to take it back apart and just set this up out of the way. I think I'm at the point now where we need to lay this thing on its side. Probably be easier. Close-up shots on it. We have so you have your Gigabyte backup BIOS, and you have the Phoenix BIOS there right there, and one just kind of backs up the other, which is kind of nice. So if you flash your BIOS to make updates so that it runs better with your new componentry, and something happens, you've got a backup that you can go back to. And here's your SATA controller. This is, I'm not sure what that one might be. This has I think it actually came with built-in video on it as well. I'm not 100% sure on that. It did come with built-in audio on it. I think that's what this chip is for, because it's kind of in the area where the audio connectors are. I had 5 PCI slots on it, and it's actually numbered on the board. And this says IR, but I don't know if it's an infrared controller or not, and SPDIF. So if you had your optical, both an SPDIF out and in, and I actually had a connector on this, I believe, which is why, because the card I had that. And then you've got an auxiliary in, power in, you've got some sort of, this is a power for something. Well, that was your CD in. I'm sorry, it's not a power, that's your CD in. So again, coming off of the optical drive, you can have directly to the CD, which goes directly into the audio controller. And again, you look at the top, this is all the different ports that you had on it, and it's got like these little spring tabs that connect onto or that kind of put pressure on the back of the plate that I have yet to get out, which I'm going to have to remove to put the new in. We can actually set this aside now because we're pretty much done with it.